Look, I have an M2X. Let's have a look what's inside the box. Oh my god, it's not there. I'm just kidding. I already had it out. I was using it to run in the Campfire Audio IEMs. I got it in Tokyo alongside the Campfire Audio IEMs, and so it was good timing in that case, because also it has a number of Bluetooth features which I was interested in. I already had a look at the M0 and it's kind of a little bit too tiny, I thought, to do a lot of stuff. It was a bit too fiddly. But Shanling thought that I might like the M2X better, and I have to say I do. It's kind of similar in size to the Fio's M9, kind of similar in actually power output and features. You have your balanced and single-ended outputs, USB-C input and or output as well, maybe. Playback controls, although this has got its scroll wheel volume power on the other side, and one micro SD card slot. Since I got the M2X, the software has been updated to version 2.3. Now that adds the ability to use Tidal. Unfortunately, it doesn't allow Tidal offline mode. Anyhow, it's got a kind of snappy basic UI that looks a lot like the one that came with Cayenne's N8, which is interesting. So I'm guessing it is made by Hybe Music. It's got a very similar layout and functionality. So we have our Android-like kind of settings here, even though it's not actually Android. But we have a screen with 6 icons on there, and it has about 3 different screens full of icons available. This is a little bit more efficient than, say, the MO, which only could show 1 icon on screen when it really should have been about 4. The thing is, if you keep swiping over, you can actually turn these icons on and off. Say, for example, I don't need a high-res playback on this. I can just turn that icon off. Let's say I don't need, let me see, I don't need to see, for example, the folders thing. Maybe I can switch that off. The thing is, when you switch them off and they go down the bottom here, if you add them back, they end up on the last screen. So the two I just switched back are on the last screen. And it does kind of change the first screen. If you do want to go back to the beginning or move them back to the front, where you can't do that, you just have to switch off all the other ones first and then switch them back on in the order you want to see them on the screen. A little bit irritating, but you can always just hit reset and just resets it to the order they prefer them in anyway. The layout is kind of fairly straightforward. You have, most things call up a series of songs or what have you. Only the albums really show album art, and kind of it's a little bit slow, of course, loading there. I've got an old 64 gigabyte micro SD card, so I'm not sure how much that is slowing things down in terms of viewing album art there. I don't know, these little players tend not to be extremely fast anyway, so I'm not sure a faster micro SD card would make a lot of difference. Of course, you have high res, which all songs again comes up with various things, and a very basic presentation of these things. Favorites, which you can add onto individual songs. Playback is a set of settings. I'll go into that in a minute. Playlists, if you add them in there, and of course frequent tracks, which is good to know. Composer, for people who like listening to classical music, for whom that's important. That's a thing that some people, older people who bought these players, complained, what do you mean there are no composer options? That was a complaint on Headfi some time ago. Of course, your usual folders, and recently added. Now, getting into the settings, you have 2 options. Your system settings, of course, your usual update library, which will update all the number of songs on there. Your wireless settings, you can go into wireless, and the settings for DLNA, finding DLNA servers or AirPlay, and scanning. You can add Wi-Fi there. Bluetooth, of course, you can also set the quality of the Bluetooth with 3 LDAC settings. Although I found LDAC HQ tended to be unreliable on devices, it's better to make it LDAC Auto. And then, of course, the only thing that's lacking is aptX HD, doesn't show up on there. The other thing is you can switch, of course, as your brightness thing, like me, if I sometimes stick these things in the car. Wi-Fi file transfer is pretty cool. It opens up a web browser which you can just browse and drag and drop files in. Of course, idle, power off. You have a sleep timer there. No, the thing is, why is this not on the same screen? And I missed this actually the first time I did it. Auto standby and auto shutdown. So the auto standby, after 1 minute of idle, device will go into standby mode. USB mode, you have a USB music a DAC connection or act as a USB drive. And clock settings and lock screen, if you want to have a lock screen with some funky album art. I'm not sure how you can load that in there, probably in your micro SD you can load stuff. Double click to wake up is handy. You can double tap the side to wake it up. That's a feature that appeared on the MO in a recent firmware update too. Button lock. Do you want the lock the volume only when it's in your pocket, say kind of thing, although the screen is off, or do you want it to lock the buttons only or lock both? DSD output mode. If you have DSD files, this is only for people who are crazy enough to stick DSD on a portable player. Some people will use these as a digital transport to something, say like a Chord Mojo or Chord Hugo 2, and for that kind of purpose they may want to play back DSD, and which method you want to use for playback, which is how it transmits the file out through USB. Your output options with PO is headphones out, and line out, of course, LO sets it at maximum volume. Theme, the interesting thing is the themes has changed the button looks, but one of them is theme 3 seems to be a high contrast mode, which might be useful for visually impaired people, though given that the text is pretty small as things go, I'm not sure it would really help considerably in actually seeing it clearly. Enlarged album art. Languages, I'll let you just, you can pause the video and have a look to see if your language is here if necessary, but that's the language selection. About, this is version 2.3, and I've got a 64 gig card in there, which may or may not slow down the view of things, and can't be sort of certain. Of course, you can do a factory reset, or a system update can either be done, you can either download it and put it on a card yourself, or just hit network update, and that's kind of exciting as the system settings get. Now, while I was actually in there, there's a little corner thing to get back to now playing. That's very handy. You can also just change whether your playback or shuffle options easily from here, and whether you want the track to be a favorite or not when that's already a favorite, so tapping that does nothing. Tapping here, you get the option to go into the playback settings, which are also available direct from the first screen as I already showed you. Maximum volume if you want to limit it for children, for example, and not accidentally blow your ears out, or their ears out. The default volume, you can have the default be a preset level, 20 is pretty low, or you can actually you can memorize where the volume position was when you shut it off. The resume mode, whether it resumes off or it stays at the track, which is what I had set because it already was showing the Beatles track I was playing, or the location within the track for people who are, say, listening to podcasts who don't want to have to go and scroll and trying to find out where they got to. Gapless on or off as usual. EQ as the same kind of equalizer as you saw on other Hi-B based things. You either have presets in here for different kinds of music, or you can do a custom one, which 3 custom presets which allow you to fiddle around with various settings, and as usual. Now gain, you have high or low as you've already seen. Filter, because it's an AKM DAC, you can set the digital filter. Sharp roll-off, technically best, probably best for acoustic music, and the slower roll-off one's probably best for things like electronic. Super slow roll-off is equivalent to pretty much non-oversampling, and probably one they basically end up sounding softer as you more or less go down the list, and so you can play around with that. It makes a very subtle difference, but not a major one. If it sounds kind of too clear for preference, then go down to a lower filter is probably the easiest one, or experiment around. Channel balance, of course, for people who need it. The play mode we already saw, whether it's repeat or shuffle, and whether folder skipper is on, whether it just jumps through folders. So that's pretty much the functionality of the thing. And then when you get back to looking through stuff that you want to play back, so we can go to album. Always looks cooler, although it takes some time to load. Concord on a Summer Night is a nice one. There you have the list of songs, or we can play all. You can also select stuff to add to a playlist, and we can create a new playlist, and we're going to call this Dave Brubeck Fiddly as Anything. Where's A V E? I'm not going to make it completely. This is going to take me all day if I have to type out his name. That'll do. Dave B will do. Okay, that's done. So that's kind of how it goes. I don't know if you can add you can add your own playlist files in here, but might be worth checking out to see if it did create a playlist file somewhere in here. So that's kind of the functionality, and once you start playing back, that's how things go. Sound-wise, the M2X sounds quite good. I can get up in the morning, plug in some headphones, and have a listen and enjoy myself, whatever I plug in general. There are, of course, some limitations to that. First of all, it doesn't really have that much power. Now, even out of the balanced output here, it has a bit less power than FiO's M9, so we're under 200 milliwatts in that. And also the peak power is at 16 ohms, whereas the M9 is at 32 ohms. Most relatively inexpensive headphones are 32 ohms impedance, and so it's not quite the most optimized. Another thing about the balanced output, and this is kind of a rant against the industry and a lot of portable audiophiles in general, is that balanced has been overhyped to the point that manufacturers will now prioritize their balanced outputs over the single-ended outputs. And this means someone will come along, as I've seen happen, buy a DAP such as this, and then they'll see, oh, everyone's ranting about how good it sounds. They'll buy a pair of headphones, or they have a pair of headphones, plug them into the single-ended output, and the sound quality won't be as good, and they'll complain, well, it doesn't sound as good as everyone says it does. And the reply, oh, you have to use the balanced output, which means re-terminating your headphones. And given that this is a relatively inexpensive player, a lot of people will be aimed to save money. To say that they have to spend more money to fix a problem, to actually use the product they buy, is rather silly. And I think the balanced output thing has become hyped because the single-ended circuit, and I think a lot of people don't understand this, only uses, it's more or less, in most devices of this type, the balanced circuit, but only half the circuit connected, with the signal return going to ground instead. So naturally, because the single-ended output has less power and less performance and doesn't sound as good, they assume that balanced in general sounds better, whereas it would have been perfectly possible for the manufacturer to make just as powerful and just as good sounding a single-ended output as they have made the balanced output, and it would have satisfied more consumers. But the advertising point, look, we have balanced, seems to sell a lot of gear. And the thing is, balanced isn't going to make a $220 DAP or any other inexpensive DAP sound as good as something that's $500, $600, $700, $1,000, $2,000. It's just not going to have that much of a difference. It really has nothing to do with balanced at all. So I want to kick the butt of all those people who have hyped on balanced stuff, which is a large number of enthusiasts, because they have kind of ruined things. So the problem is with this, I'm going to test it mostly with a balanced output. So I'm going to assume that people are going to use them mostly with a balanced output because that's what's going to be optimum. But it is kind of crapping on a lot of consumers who just don't know and who don't realize they're not going to get optimum sound quality using regular headphones. That rant being said, I tried the M2X with, well, I did with everything. We had inexpensive IEMs. I have some Shozy CPs here, for example. More expensive IEMs, or much more expensive IEMs, Campfire Audio Solaris, which is kind of my benchmark for testing. I even have a very expensive pair of Hi-Fi Man RE2000s with a suitably expensive balanced cable attached so I could test well. I also have Bluetooth. They can't fit in the picture here, which just shows how tiny this thing is. Odyssey Mobius, which I use for my LDAC testing. And also I could connect it as a transport to a Mojo using actually a FIO cable, so I cheated a little bit there and that worked well. So in that we have quite a lot of usage situations which will work with the M2X, and kind of, as I said, in sound quality it sounded generally good. It isn't tuned to sound any particular way. For example, some DAPs that we've seen are tuned to sound a bit warm or something like that. This doesn't seem to be tuned to sound any particular way at all, and is generally, I call generally neutral. In terms of absolute sound quality, well, I first did a hiss test with the good old Solaris, and I can say that the hiss is almost zero of anything when there's no music playing, or even when music is playing and I shut it off and the amp section still hasn't shut off. There's only the absolute minutest background electrical noise coming through with this. So in that regard, it performed very, very well. Going from there, I'd probably say that the sound quality was a step behind FIO's M9, and I evaluated that with things such as the RE2000s and the Solaris, so I had a better impression of kind of the absolute performance of this DAP. Now in doing that, I level matched a 1 kilohertz tone to ensure that I was not being fooled by different volume levels. And I'd say that while this sounds kind of a little bit smooth, some of that smoothness is really kind of a lack of detail, and there was a jump up in kind of detail and clarity going to the M9. And considering this is $220, and relative to that, you know, the M9 is $300, which is a big jump up, we're still way behind where the law of diminishing returns starts to kick in. So I'd say price versus sound quality increase, there was a noticeable jump up as you spend the greater amount of money, which I tend to find in the under $500 mark. It was still better sounding than something like the the Fostex TM2 Bluetooth earphones, which I plugged into the Solaris and other IEMs. So it was still a step up there, even though the Fostex Bluetooth earphones are $300. However, with full-sized headphones being fairly low powered, just like the M9, if you start to listen more than a moderate level, you start to listen loud, then things start to really fall apart. If you're the kind of person who wants to rock out using a DAP, it's just not going to happen with something like this. You need an extra amp, or you just need a better DAP in general. I think where it really came into its own was with Bluetooth. So once we got the wires off and we started using things like Odyssey's Mobius, that's where I reckon the M2X really came into its own. No need to worry about what wires you use. I connected this up using LDAC Auto because I found that switching to high quality always in any kind of device seems to result in more dropouts, whereas I don't notice any drop off in sound quality using the auto mode. Now, just like with other DAPs I've used, I could go a couple of rooms away and still get with no dropouts whatsoever. So it's performed up to as I would expect. Of course, your mileage may vary. Some people have been in very crowded areas where there may be a lot of wireless stuff being broadcast around, and it has caused dropouts even with stuff that's very close to the headphones. So don't take that as a necessary guarantee that it's going to work perfectly for you. One other really useful thing about high quality modern Bluetooth is it's very low power using. Now, the standby mode on this in terms of usage was excellent. I could leave it literally running for weeks in standby mode with the screen off and it would use almost no power. I think it was something like I only used about 10% power over about a week in standby mode. Whereas even the screen on, just been shooting this video, it's dropped down a couple of percent already just using the screen on these DAPs at full brightness in this case uses the most power of anything. Another thing to note, as I've already said, this is only USB 2. You're not going to get high-speed transfers or high-speed power charging, but one thing at least you could use it as is as a transport to something like I used a Cord Mojo. If I turn this on, and I turn this on and plug this in, it even gives a nice indicator showing that it is the audio is now connected. So I reckon where this really comes into its own is as a Bluetooth transport or a wired transport for something like a Mojo. Whereas kind of the headphone output had the limitations that I already mentioned. If you don't have balanced headphones or IEMs, well, you're kind of limited in how its performance will be, even though it does sound basically decent. The other thing, of course, is that what I'm guessing is a Hibi-based operating system doesn't allow tidal offline mode. And of course, not allowing tidal offline mode means that you're kind of limited to streaming it only. So someone who may be looking for a DAP to use around the house, for example, and stream tidal or just play music off a micro SD card, that could find this very satisfactory. It's also far less fiddly to use than the little MO, whereas the MO is nice and light and be suitable for attaching to your clothes for, say, going jogging, and this is kind of considerably heavier. So it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but it's much easier to use with these much bigger screens. So I hope that gives you a good overview, and thanks to Shanling for sending one of these over for me to evaluate and listen with. If you did like my videos, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe, as I'll be making many more. Also, I have to thank everyone who helped me make these videos. These people, my patrons and supporters, for the equivalent of buying me, say, a coffee once a month, or the equivalent of the slightly more generous who buy me the equivalent of a dinner once in a while, you get to support making these videos. And as well, these people get to see the videos in advance without ads, and they go in the draw to win free stuff as well. If I have anything sitting in my cupboard, audio-wise, which I have no longer got a use for, they get to go in the draw to win it. They also can get my free advice anytime they want, with help with audio gear and buying decisions and anything like that. There are also other perks available, so if you'd like to become a supporter and help me out and join our little community, check out the links below. Also, if you're thinking of buying an M2X, please check out the link to buy the M2X down below as well. It will also help me out and likewise help support making these videos. So thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.